Doobie-doobie-doo. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati.
All right. Happy Thursday, guys. It's Thirsty Thursday in the house. Welcome to Sabs podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. If you are new, I want to let you know that Sabs podcast is a part of Revolutionary Blackout Network. You can catch me there on Thursdays and Fridays, and you can catch me here on Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and Sunday. I want to give a shout out to everyone watching on YouTube, Rockfin, Twitter, and Rumble. And welcome back, guys. I hope you had a great Wednesday. I know I did. I've been watching a lot of scary movies, and yes, I continue the scary movies and scary shows into November, into the month of November. And I actually just finished a scary show last night on Netflix called Slasher. It was actually really good. I was like really getting into this, But yeah, welcome back, guys. So we have a lot to discuss tonight. We will do call in tonight after the show. I'm pretty sure you guys are going to want to talk, considering the topics that we do have. So we will do call in tonight. If you have not had a chance to do so, go ahead and respond to that poll, which is linked to the live chat. If the presidential election were today, who would you vote for? And I did not put Joe Biden there. I mainly put the candidates that are, running independent or in the Democratic Party, which was like Marianne. That's why Marianne's there. I did not put Dean because Dean just announced. Plus, I don't think any of you would be interested in Dean anyway. And then I also wanted to have an option for not voting because I think that's last time I did not have that option. So I'm curious to see how many of you are not planning on voting at all. But anyway, let's go ahead and start to dive right in because I want to make sure I stay on time tonight. And we do have a lot to say. So I want to go ahead and give a shout out to everyone who is a Sabby patron. Thank you guys so much for your support. You're out here doing the damn thing. If you're interested in being a Sabby patron, I have 5 categories. Ultimate, Sabinators. There's also Sabsters in the house, Sabbies, and of course, members. All of their names are listed here. You can also see their names scrolling across the bottom of the screen there on the ticker. And I want to give a special shout out to new Sabby patrons. Over here, we call them newbies. Let's give it up for Karen Ellenick, Tom Hall, and Tony Fami. Welcome, guys. And thank you so much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get right into it because, like I said, I have a lot to cover in a limited amount of time to do so because I do want to make sure I am on call-in right when I'm supposed to be on call-in this time and not later on. So I do want to go ahead and jump right into that thumbnail. So I hope you're ready for it tonight, guys, because the narrative is shifting. The narrative is shifting, and that is because of the numbers of people that have come out and protest across the world. So it is having an impact, and this is why I continue to say that we need a mass movement. The more people we have in the streets, the better. But what are we discussing tonight? Tonight we are discussing RFK Jr. and Cornel West polls. We have new polling numbers that have come in. I think you guys are going to want to see this. I don't think the Democratic Party or Joe Biden has his reelection in the bag the way that he thinks that he does. And I think it is a tremendous mistake for the Democratic Party to not have primary debates. And we'll get into all of that. I'm also going to discuss, oh, buddy, the squad challenge. Now you'll see there's Cori Bush, AOC, and Pramila Jayapal. And we're going to get into this story as well. It appears to be trouble here brewing for certain members of the squad. We're also going to discuss Zelensky is big mad. Zelensky is big mad. He's feeling a little neglected, a little neglected. So we're going to get into that tonight. And we're also going to discuss Pramila Jayapal meet the press. So again, when I tell you that the narrative is starting to shift, pay attention. Pay attention because things are starting to happen here. And I don't know why, but Pramila Jayapal always looks scared in these pictures. Like she always has this look on her face like, I don't know, like she's startled or scared or something. I don't know. But we're going to go ahead and dive into our first story, which is about Zelensky. Now, if you are not aware, Zelensky recently had an interview with Time magazine, and apparently he is not too happy about all the attention that is going to Israel and Palestine instead of Ukraine. We have to remember before the war started, in reference to Israel and Palestine, Ukraine was getting a lot of attention from Joe Biden, from other members of Congress, and of course, the press, the mainstream media. But now, because of the war in Israel and Palestine, the attention on Ukraine is not as big as it used to be. And Zelensky is noticing that. I'm sure you guys have probably noticed it. And he had some things to say. He has some things to say. So in this interview with Time magazine, it says, nobody believes in our victory like I do. Inside, Volodymyr Zelensky's struggle to keep Ukraine in the fight. Let's dive right in. Look, even in this picture, he looks big mad. Big. And the look on his face in this picture. How dare they pay attention to someone else? How dare they? So let's go ahead, and I actually want to get started right about here. So one of the things they mentioned is that Zelensky apparently was late to this interview. It says the reason he later said was the exhaustion he felt that night, not only from the demands of leadership during the war, but also the persistent need to convince his allies that with their help, Ukraine can win. Nobody believes in our victory like I do. Nobody. So, yeah, nobody. Nobody believes that they can win because we see that you can. We see that you cannot win. Ukraine has been losing, right? And all the weapons and aid packages that have gone to Ukraine has not shifted this conflict in their favor. Obviously, it is very clear that Russia is winning here. He goes on to say, takes all your power, your energy. You understand? It takes so much of everything. So let's go on here. It is only getting harder. 20 months into the war, after a fifth of Ukraine's territory remains under Russian occupation, tens and thousands of soldiers and civilians have been killed. And Zelensky can feel during his travels that global interest in the war has slackened. Notice here they mention tens and thousands of soldiers and civilians have been killed, which is exactly why a lot of us were calling for peace, calling for a ceasefire. There are many casualties in war. It goes on to say, so has the level of international support. The scariest thing is that part of the world got used to the war in Ukraine. Exhaustion with the war rolls along like a wave. You see it in the United States, in Europe. We see that as soon as they start getting a little tired, it becomes like a show to them. I can't watch this rerun for the 10th time. Let's compare this to the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. This is something I think he is correct about here, which is the fact that at the beginning of a war, I do feel like DC politicians and, of course, American citizens as well, we're more focused on it, right? It's the beginning of things. People are heavily paying attention to it. But as time goes on, eventually people just kind of get used to it, which is a bad thing to say, but it happens. It happened with Afghanistan. 20 years, right? 20 years in Afghanistan. Eventually, after a couple years, people just started to tune out and even started to forget that we were over there in the first place. Same thing with the war in Iraq. So it's not uncommon for people to it becomes normalized in a way that you just know, yeah, there's this conflict in Afghanistan. The US is engaged in that. But after a while, I feel like people aren't as focused on it as they were in the very beginning. It also doesn't help that now when you look at this war with Israel, one of the things that you have to note is it's a very different situation, whereas Ukraine and Russia both have weapons that they can use against each other. In the situation with Israel, it's different because Gaza does not have an army. They don't have a military. They're not allowed to have a military. So essentially what you have is this dominant power, which is the state of Israel, which has way more advanced weapons and technology. They control all of the resources. So we see this power taking away resources from Gaza, which they had limited resources to begin with. And you see this power conflicting essentially what we've been referring to as a genocide on the Palestinian people. These are people who are trapped in a fenced-in space and they can't get out. So they're kind of just stuck there. So it's different when you compare it to what's happening with Ukraine, because Ukraine has backing from the United States to fight back. Gaza does not. So Zelensky's feeling a little kind of way. He's feeling some kind of way. Public support for aid to Ukraine has been in decline for months in the US, and Zelensky's visit did nothing to revive it. Some 41% of Americans want Congress to provide more weapons to Kyiv, down from 65% in June, when Ukraine began a major counteroffensive, according to the Reuters survey taken shortly after Zelensky's departure. That offensive has proceeded at an excruciating pace with enormous losses, making it ever more difficult for Zelensky to convince partners that victory is around the corner. With the outbreak of the war in Israel, even keeping the world's attention on Ukraine has become a major challenge. I want to talk about this decrease in support from Americans in reference to the U.S. sending aid to Ukraine. I think that the Biden administration, I think this is something that caught them by surprise. The fact that more and more Americans do not want forever wars. More and more Americans do not want war at all. The days of the George W. Bush, warmonger tactics, it doesn't work the way that it did back then. And so more Americans are speaking up against war. More Americans are becoming anti-war. So the type of support that more Americans had after September 11 for these types of conflicts, that has decreased over time. And more Americans are starting to say, why are we sending our money and our resources to intervene in these conflicts abroad that have nothing to do with what's happening here in the United States? So more people are speaking out against that. And I don't really think the Biden administration was ready for this. I don't really think they were ready for the numbers of people that came out into the streets globally, protesting against this war in Israel. I don't think they were prepared for that. And I don't think they were ready to respond to the response that they've been getting in reference to both of these conflicts. After his visit to Washington, Time followed the president and his team back to Kyiv, hoping to understand how they would react to the signals they had received. especially the insistent calls for Zelensky to fight corruption inside his own government and the fading enthusiasm for a war with no end in sight. On my first day in Kyiv, I asked one member of his circle how the president was feeling. The response came without seconds hesitation: angry. The usual spark of his optimism, his sense of humor, his tendency to liven up a meeting in the war room with a bit of banter or a bawdy joke, none of that has survived into the second year of an all-out war. Now he walks in, gets the updates, gives the orders, and walks out. Now, this is coming from a longtime member of his team. Another tells me that most of all, Zelensky feels betrayed by his Western allies. They have left him without the means to win the war, only the means to survive it. Now, I just want to add in here a little bit of update. It was just announced that the U.S. government is sending another over $400 million weapons package to Ukraine. So the United States government has not forgotten about Zelensky. They have not forgotten about Ukraine. It just appears to me that Zelensky is not happy that he's no longer in the spotlight anymore, that a more pressing conflict has now taken that spotlight away from him. But the U.S. government is still sending Ukraine aid. So what's it really about? Let's go on. But his convictions haven't changed. Despite the recent setbacks on the battlefield, he does not intend to give up fighting or to sue for any kind of peace. On the contrary, his belief in Ukraine's ultimate victory over Russia has hardened into a form that worries some of his advisors. It is unmovable, verging on the Messianic. He deludes himself. One of his closest aides tells me in frustration, "We're out of options. We're not winning, but try telling him that." And this is something that we've been saying all along, right? Like, it's obvious that they're not. Mainstream media tried to convince the American people that they were winning. They were not winning. And now we hear more confirmation about this from people closest to him. And he's the only one walking around saying that we can beat this, we can win this, when it is very clear that that is not the case. How many more packages does the U.S. government have to send to Ukraine for Zelensky to finally realize that he has no chance here? How many? He wants to continue fighting, meaning he's going to continue to bleed the U.S. government dry. How long is this going to go on? How long? Zelensky's stubbornness, some of his aides say, has hurt their team's efforts to come up with a new strategy, a new message. As they have debated the future of the war, one issue has remained taboo: the possibility of negotiating a peace deal with the Russians. Judging by recent surveys, most Ukrainians would reject such a move, especially if it entailed the loss of any occupied territory. Zelensky remains dead set against even a temporary truce. For us, it would mean leaving this wound open for future generations. Leaving the wound open for future generations. I would imagine having a crumbling economy, which is happening, what's happening to Ukraine right now. And when this is all said and done, I'll be surprised if they even have an economy left. I would say that that would actually be an open wound for future generations. Maybe it will calm some people down inside our country and outside, at least those who want to wrap up things to wrap up at any price. But for me, that's a problem, because we are left with this explosive force. We only delay its detonation. For now, he is intent on winning the war on Ukrainian terms, and he is shifting tactics to achieve that, aware that the flow of Western arms could dry up over time. The Ukrainians have ramped up production of drones and missiles, which they have used to attack Russian supply routes, command centers, and ammunition depots far behind enemy lines. The Russians have responded with more bombing raids against civilians, more missile strikes against the infrastructure that Ukraine will need to heat homes and keep the lights on through the winter. Zelensky describes it as a war of wills, and he fears that if the Russians are not stopped in Ukraine, the fighting will spread beyond its borders. Let me just chime in here for a second. This is the same type of fear mongering that some politicians are using right now in reference to Hamas. I don't know if you guys have seen this on Twitter, but some politicians are now saying that Hamas could come to the United States. Really? They can't leave Gaza, you fool. Let me get this straight. They can't leave Gaza. They can't get into Egypt, but they're going to come to the United States. This is the fear mongering, guys. This is what I was telling you. This is what they're doing. Zelensky goes on to say, I have long lived with this fear, he says. A third world war could start in Ukraine, continue in Israel, and move on from there to Asia, and then explode somewhere else. And if that were to happen, whose fault would that be? Because, see, calling for a ceasefire, calling for peace, calling for some type of negotiation would prevent all of that, all of it. But it is very clear that Zelensky wants this to continue. This is all on NATO. NATO has a lot to do with this here. They wanted this war, and that's why we're here now. That was his message in Washington. Help Ukraine stop the war before it spreads and before it's too late. He worries his audience has stopped paying attention. You know, I wouldn't say that people have stopped paying attention, but I will say that people know that you can't win. People know this. And I believe Zelensky knows this as well. I believe he knows this as well. They're just bleeding the U.S. dry. Let's go on to this piece here. At the end of last year, during his previous visit to Washington, Zelensky received a hero's welcome. The White House sent a U.S. Air Force jet to pick him up in eastern Poland a few days before Christmas. And with an escort from a NATO spy plane and an F-15 Eagle fighter, delivered him to Joint Base Andrews outside the U.S. Capitol. That evening, Zelensky appeared before a joint session of Congress to declare that Ukraine had defeated Russia in the battle for minds of the world. I told you guys then that wasn't true. Watching his speech from the balcony, I counted 13 standing ovations before I stopped keeping track. One senator told me he could not remember a time in 3 decades on Capitol Hill when a foreign leader received such an admiring reception. A few right-wing Republicans refused to stand or applaud for Zelensky, but the votes to support him were bipartisan and overwhelming throughout last year. This time around, the atmosphere has changed. Assistance to Ukraine had become a sticking point in the debate over the federal budget. One of Zelensky's foreign policy advisors urged him to call off the trip in September, warning that the atmosphere was too fraught. Congressional leaders declined to let Zelensky deliver a public address on Capitol Hill. His aides tried to arrange an in-person appearance for him, get this, guys, on Fox News and an interview with Oprah Winfrey. Neither one came through. Now, I just want to chime in here and say this. Honey, if Oprah told you no, that's bad news. That is bad news. We all know that Oprah Winfrey likes to take on these complex situations, and she loves to interview people that are controversial. We all know this. So if Oprah told you no, what does that tell you, Zelensky? What does that tell you? You got snubbed by Oprah. She don't even want to talk to you. And then this part here, it goes on to say, instead of the morning of September 21st, Zelensky met in private with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy before making his way to the old Senate chamber, where lawmakers grilled him behind closed doors. Most of Zelensky's usual critics stayed silent in the session. Senator Ted Cruz strolled in more than 20 minutes late. The Democrats, for their part, wanted to understand where the war was headed and how badly Ukraine needed U.S. support. They asked me straight up, if we don't give you the aid, what happens? Zelensky recalls. What happens is we will lose. Interesting. So yeah, I did notice that when he was here recently, that they didn't seem as receptive to him this time around. It goes on to say Zelensky's performance left a deep impression on some of the lawmakers present. Angus King, an independent senator from Maine, recalled the Ukrainian leader telling his audience, "You're giving money. We're giving our lives." But it was not enough. 10 days later, Congress passed a bill to temporarily avert a government shutdown. It included no assistance to Ukraine. But I just told you, they've already approved a $400 million aid package to Ukraine as of today. But it seems like to me, Zelensky feels that Israel and Gaza may be getting a little too much attention, and he feels like the U.S. government may forget about him and he may be neglected. Now, I'll say to this, I think some of this has to deal with a little bit of vanity as well, too. Right? I think Zelensky got used to the public spotlight. Him and his wife were on the cover of Vogue magazine. Like, this didn't make no sense to me. He was nominated, or he not nominated. He won Time Magazine's Person of the Year. So I think he was used to getting a lot of that attention. And for Oprah Winfrey to reject him, I think he just feels some kind of way, right? But to me, I feel like he just wants that attention. Remember, this guy used to be a comedian. Now, Nico House had something to say about this. I thought this was really interesting, the way that he described Zelensky's state of mind at this point in time, when you know that you just cannot win, but you're continuing to tell people that you can. I honestly just think that Zelensky has gotten used to having that attention and that spotlight. He's becoming somewhat of a ham. He's loving this. And now that people are starting to tell him no, and even Fox News told him no, that is a big sign. But listen to what Nico had to say. I thought this was funny.
According to this article in Time Magazine, Zelensky says he feels betrayed by his Western allies. He says they've left him with no means to win the war, only a means to survive it. As if they ever actually had a chance to win that war anyway. But whatever. At a time where Bibi Netanyahu was getting anything and everything he wants from the West to support his genocide in Gaza, it's looking like Ukraine and Zelensky are trying to cope with being replaced. Hell, during his recent visit to the States, they tried to get him on Fox News, and they even tried to get him on Oprah. Both declined to entertain Zelensky. Now you know it's bad whenever Oprah is declining to entertain your sob story, because we know there is nothing more that Oprah loves than a sob story that can make her some money. But it looks like the West and the mainstream in general have collectively decided that they can no longer profit off pushing Zelensky's agenda in Ukraine. Now, you would think that this would mean that maybe Zelensky is more than willing to start engaging in peace talks with Russia, but according to his advisors, it's the opposite. They say his resolve has hardened to the point where they feel he is completely delusional. His aide even said in frustration, "We're out of options. We're not winning." But try telling him that. Zelensky is learning a very difficult lesson that many of us tried to warn him about from the beginning of this escalation in Ukraine. And that lesson is, the only thing potentially more dangerous than being an enemy of the United States is being an ally of the United States. Because when it is most convenient for them, they will toss you out like yesterday's leftovers.
Dangerous being an ally of the United States. This is so true. Once it gets to the point where there's nothing in it for the United States government, they will forget about you. Well said, Nico. Well said. I'll go ahead and take that comment on Rockfin, Eric. All right. Thank you for the tip on Rockfin, Roger. Sab, I forgot to send you what I just direct messaged you. The article Washington Post just did a story of that I took a screenshot of where they see the coast is clear to tell the truth. He has heard of us financing Ukrainian Nazis and the CIA training them. Like the proverbial side chick finding out that America won't leave his wife. Sorry, it's funny. America won't leave his wife, Israel, for them to live happily ever after. Zelensky is now realizing this. Well said. And I'm going to go to some of the comments here. Thank you for the super chat, P. Smith. Miss Zelensky spent $1 million at Cartier. JB says, gosh, he's such a big baby. Yes, he is. And thank you for the super chat, Roger. Kick rocks, Zelensky. And Kristen says, Nico, always on point. There you go. There you go. Yeah. One of the things I was surprised that that Time article actually pointed out the corruption that is happening in Ukraine, because that's something that some of us in independent media have been touching on that a little bit, but I was actually surprised for Time magazine to actually point that out, because it is a problem. And there have been questions about where's all the money going, where are all these, aid packages going that we're sending to Ukraine. There have been claims allegedly that it's not being used in the places that it's supposed to be used. So surprised they said that, but they did. Ronan says America can't afford a rogue, scorned lover threatening to scream the tales of abuse. Oh, that is an interesting way to put that, Ronan. That is an interesting way. All right, we're going to go on to our next story, which is about Pramila Jayapal. So Meet the Press has been getting some pretty interesting interviews recently. Pramila Jayapal was just on there mainly to talk about this conflict with Israel and Palestine. And I know you guys are like, oh, we're hearing about this again. But yes, like there's breaking news about this every other day, I feel like. And there were some things that Pramila Jayapal mentioned in this interview that I was kind of surprised that she said. I was surprised she said this, and I would not be surprised if they start coming for her next. There are some things I agree with. There are some things I disagree with. But let's go ahead and jump into this discussion with Pramila Jayapal on Meet the Press. Listen to this.
Joining me now is Democratic Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal of Washington State, who chairs the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Congresswoman Jayapal, welcome to Meet the Press.
Thank you so much, Kristen. It's great to be with you.
It is great to have you on a very busy Sunday. So let's begin with Israel. You have called for a ceasefire in Gaza. Do you believe there's a non-military solution to the crisis that would neutralize the terror threat from Hamas and also bring home the hostages?
Let me just pause right there, because I don't think some of you may have realized that. But Pramila Jayapal is one of the congressmen and women that has called for a ceasefire. Now, it seems to be that more people in the House are willing to say this and not as many people in the Senate. Although tomorrow night, I'll get into another discussion. We're going to cover the Senate about the ones that have been vocal so far to speak out and the ones that are just being cowardly as usual. But she is one of the people that has called for a ceasefire, which is interesting. That's why I said they'll probably come after her next. Let's continue.
Well, Kristen, I called for a ceasefire, or at minimum, a cessation of hostilities about 12 days ago. And in that time, since the beginning of this horrific war, what we have seen is now, in addition to the 1,400 Israelis who were killed, in addition to the hostages that have been taken, hundreds of hostages that have been taken by Hamas, what we are now seeing is 8,000 Palestinians who have been killed by Israeli airstrikes, 3,000 of whom are children.
Let me pause here for just a second. I want to give you an update on that number. It is now over 9,000, by the way. It's now over 9,000. Okay.
We've watched 120 premature babies who are likely to die without the fuel to run their incubators. And we see 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza who are going to either have to deliver their babies or die, but about 150 babies being delivered every day without food, water, or fuel. This is not a situation that is going to help either advance our long-term strategic goals of taking out Hamas, of ensuring security and peace for both Israelis and Palestinians, or frankly, our ability to hold our moral authority on the world stage by ensuring that Israel follows the international humanitarian laws, or the laws of war, as President Biden has called for.
Congresswoman.
Pause in here for a second. How do you enforce another country to follow the laws of war? How do you actually do that? Because Joe Biden has met with Netanyahu multiple times now to talk about the war and to talk about following those laws and guidelines, which the state of Israel is not doing. So how do you actually enforce that they do that? That's the question that I have. Is Joe Biden going to call for the U.S. government to pull aid from the state of Israel in order to get Netanyahu to follow the rules here in reference to war? Is he going to do that? No, he's not going to do that. So how do you actually enforce it? And this is going to lead to another piece where I'm going to bring in the UN here as well, and the role of the UN, because it's one thing to come forward and say, this country did this, they're committing war crimes, there's a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. It's one thing to do that. But my question has always been, what are the next steps after that? And I've brought this up before when there have been a number of people that have actually spoken at the UN. Garland Nixon, Danny Haiphong, Max Blumenthal, Aaron Monte, they've all spoken at the UN. And I think these speeches are great. But my question always remains, what happens after that? What does the UN actually do other than declare humanitarian crisis, declare that there's a genocide happening, declare that there are war crimes? What do they actually do? We're going to get into that in just a second.
As the New York Times points out today, Hamas is actually sitting on a lot of that fuel, food, and aid that you referenced. Their headquarters is underneath that hospital there. So ultimately, they are the ones who are depriving the civilians of Gaza of all of those necessary aid items that you referenced. If there were to be a ceasefire, what's the guarantee that Hamas would abide by it, Congresswoman?
Now, you see where I'm about to prove her wrong? Ladies and gentlemen, if she can tell you, if they can tell you that they know exactly where Hamas is hiding, then doesn't that also tell you that Israel can just do a specific target and not hurt the civilians? Think about this, folks. Let's use our brains. Okay? This isn't rocket science. If that is true, what she's saying, that is laid out by the New York Times, if that is the case, if they know exactly where they are, why are they not doing specific targets at that location if they know they're underneath the hospital? Destroying the hospital doesn't make them leave the underground. So if they're underneath that building and you destroyed the building and they're still underneath, you didn't destroy them. Think about this, folks. The next time that someone says this to you, push back on that and say, well, if you know where they are, why don't you just do a specific target? Why don't you just go right in there if you know where they're at? Why don't you just go? Remember, Gaza does not have a military. They don't have an army. This doesn't make any sense. You mean to tell me that the IDF, the state of Israel, is not more powerful than Hamas? Think about that, guys. Use your brain. Use your brain. Let's go on.
Well, look, Kristen, first of all, nobody has any love for Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization that has deprived the Palestinian people, absolutely, of many, many things in the time of their rule. And let's not forget that the last election where Hamas was elected was 16 years ago. Half of Palestinians are children. They were not part of that. And Hamas is not Palestinians, and Palestinians are not Hamas. We have to
notice what she's saying now. See, they were not saying this before, you guys. Before the mass protests started to happen, they weren't saying that Hamas is not Palestinians and Palestinians is not Hamas. They were talking about it as though it was all one thing. That was something I did notice, and people were criticizing that and critiquing that. So pay attention. This part right here where she said, let me go back just a little bit.
That has deprived the Palestinian people, absolutely, of many, many things in the time of their rule. And let's not forget that the last election where Hamas was elected was 16 years ago. Half of Palestinians are children. They were not part of that. And Hamas is not Palestinians, and Palestinians are not Hamas. We have to
Now more of them are coming forward, and they're actually admitting what those of us in independent media said way before they were admitting this, that the majority of people in Gaza are kids. They weren't even alive. A lot of them weren't even alive when the last election happened. Now you're noticing some of them are starting. Again, I have to tell you, I really do believe that this is because of the pressure that has come from the protest.
To be very clear about that. But humanitarian agencies have been sending aid through approved partners. And before October 7th, it was about 500 trucks per day. Now, Kristen, since the beginning of this war, we have seen less than 100 trucks delivered. Israel has stopped the fuel from coming in and being delivered by trusted partners. And Kristen, I just think we have to recognize that this is a double standard. The United States rightly called out Russia for its siege of Ukraine, rightly called out the attacks on the power infrastructure, the refusal to provide food and water and fuel to the Ukrainians. And we have to recognize that our credibility and our authority on the moral stage is greatly diminished if we do not also call out these this siege that Israel is launching on Gaza as violations of international law.
Let me pause there for a second. So what she's talking about is the humanitarian aid that has been sent to them, which, by the way, notice that she mentioned that they were sending them humanitarian aid before October 7th. And to that point, you should ask, why did they have to send them humanitarian aid before October 7th? Because the people have been deprived of food and resources because Israel controls the resources. And this is not to say that they weren't allowing food to come in before October 7th, but they were controlling what comes in and what doesn't come in. They were cutting off the electricity. Like, that didn't happen after October 7th. That has always been a constant thing for the past couple of decades, right? So listen to what she is telling you, what she's saying. She's telling you that there was already humanitarian aid being sent into Gaza prior to October 7th, which basically confirms what the UN has said before, that there is a humanitarian crisis that is happening in Gaza. And the UN made that statement before October 7th. And this is the question that people need to ask when they interview people like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. They need to ask them, if there wasn't so much of an issue with the people in Gaza, and if the state of Israel has been right to them and has been treating them well, then why was the U.S. sending them humanitarian aid prior to October 7th? Push back on people when they tell you this started October 7th. But the double standard there that she brought up in reference to the U.S. response in reference to Russia and Ukraine, they said Russia was depriving people of these resources, and their response to when Israel does it.
Losing credibility, and frankly, we're being isolated in the rest of the world.
Let me ask you about what some of your fellow Democrats are saying. Senator John Fetterman, a fellow progressive, said, quote, "Now is not the time to talk about a ceasefire." He added, quote, "Hamas does not want peace. They want to destroy Israel. We can talk about a ceasefire after Hamas is neutralized." Going back to that original question, how do you neutralize Hamas? What's your response to Senator Fetterman?
So let me say something here. When I talked about this the other night, First of all, stop calling John Fetterman progressive. He is not a progressive. He told you so himself. He was not a progressive when he was running for office. Stop saying that. And Pramila Jayapal should have pushed back on that. She should have said, well, John Fetterman actually is not a progressive. He said multiple times that he's not. Push back on that.
My response is that we need immediate, sustained humanitarian aid to flow into Gaza. We need the bombings, and you can call it a humanitarian truce, as 140 countries said in the resolution that was passed at the United Nations. The United States was one of only 14 countries to oppose that resolution. Call it a humanitarian truce. Use that time to make sure we get the hostages out, both American hostages and Israeli hostages. Let's not forget, Kristen, that we also have 500 U.S. citizens plus their families who were told to go to southern Gaza because they were not safe in northern Gaza. That was the part that was going to be bombed. They are now at the Rafah crossing, and all these days later, 3 weeks later, they are still there. The United States has a responsibility to de-escalate the situation. We see the escalation on the northern border with Hezbollah, and I think this is the moment for us to de-escalate, to call for a cessation of hostilities, and to allow humanitarian aid through and the negotiators to work to get the hostages released.
Let me ask you about some of your comments. You have characterized Israel as a, quote, racist state. After a backlash, you clarified that you don't believe the existence of Israel is racist, but that the government engages in racist policies. Can you explain clearly, what do you mean by that, Congresswoman?
Before she explains what she means by that, this is the problem that I have with Pramila Jayapal. Every now and then she will make a statement that is actually pretty true. But as soon as she gets pushback, as he receives backlash, she will retract her statement. Pramila Jayapal, although she's a part of the Progressive Caucus, she's the one that throws a stone and then runs and hides. Like, she's totally fine being front and center as long as she doesn't get backlash. But the moment she receives backlash, she wants to go hide or cry in the corner. And that's not being a progressive. Like, when you're progressive at all times, not just when it's convenient to be progressive. Think about people who are revolutionary leaders in this country. You think about people like Malcolm X. Think about people like MLK. Think about people like Fred Hampton. They weren't radical only when it was convenient to do so. They weren't radical only when they did not receive pushback, and they got a ton of pushback. But they didn't change what they believed because they got heat from people. Now, I'm not saying Pramila Jayapal has to be like Malcolm X, but right now, the so-called progressive wing of the Democratic Party, they're supposed to be the ones that you're gonna take heat from people because you went into a corporate establishment party. So you're going to take heat. But you're supposed to be there to push these things, to push a progressive agenda, to push progressive policies, not to put these things on the table. And the moment that you get pushback, you take it off the table so that you can remain in a safe seat. Now, let this finish, and I'll come back because I want you to hear what she says she means by that.
Well, Kristen, I clarified this right away, not after a backlash. Within 12 hours of making the statement, I clarified that what I meant is that the existence of Israel is absolutely legitimate. And I think the world has come to see it as legitimate. However, there are racists within the Netanyahu government, and there are racist policies that Israel has been carrying out. I think it is important for us to recognize that we need to be able to criticize the policies of the Israeli government and not be called anti-Semitic. I really believe that conversation is changing in a way that is not helpful. And let me say this too, that at the end of the day, the president and the United States is absolutely responsible because we also have been the largest military backer of aid to Israel.
Yeah.
We need to be able to question where U.S. taxpayer dollars are going and what accountability the United States has in ensuring, for example, that when the president calls for Israel to adhere to the international laws of war, that they actually are doing that. Otherwise,
Pause here for just a second. Does Pramila Jayapal make these statements without the number of protests that happen across the world? No, none of them. None of them make these statements without this is what I said before about outside pressure. When people say, well, we have to do it through electoral politics. No. No, the pressure is supposed to come from the outside. It should always come from the outside. So for people who still feel like the only way to do things and push things is to have these progressives going through the Democratic Party, this is a perfect example of what I just showed you. What has been happening over the past couple of weeks, the protests that continue to increase. There's going to be another huge one, November 4th, which is this Saturday in DC. That's what you have to put the pressure on the politicians. If everybody would have just stayed at home, and let's say those protests wouldn't have happened, does Pramila Jayapal have this conversation in the same context that she's having it right now? Probably not. She's been pushed to do so. She's been pushed by her constituents. Let's continue, because let's keep it real. Because for the longest time, the only person that was still fighting on this issue was Rashida Tlaib. And a lot of times she was standing by her damn self.
As we are complicit in a way that almost no other country in the world is.
Congresswoman, let me ask you about some developments surrounding President Biden this week. One, we spoke to leaders in Michigan who said they were concerned that he is losing support among Arab and Palestinian citizens there because of his full-throated support in Israel. That also came against the backdrop of Congressman Dean Phillips announcing he is running against President Biden. Are you concerned that in a general election, both of these things could weaken President Biden's chances?
Well, let me say, Kristen, that I have been one of President Biden's biggest supporters. I have been proud to be a partner as he has been courageous and strong on the domestic front. He has really called out the injustices for average working Americans across this country.
But is he going to be weakened, Congresswoman, with this?
Workers.
Will he be weakened
Well, I
with
feel
this?
like
This is how she saves her seat. She got to make sure she says something positive in there about Joe Biden. This is how she saves her seat. This is how she prevents, AIPAC and other PACs going after her to try to primary challenge someone against her to get her out of that seat. This is what they do. This is what, I think Joe Biden has been doing. Professional ass kisser. Professional. Here comes the ass kissing.
I need to say this because what I think is that the president needs to be just as courageous on this issue so that we keep the unity within our country for the support of the incredible things he has done. He is, I think, going to be challenged to explain an issue of this moral significance to people. The American people are actually quite far away from where the president and even Congress, the majority of Congress, has been on Israel and Gaza. They support the right for Israel to defend itself, to exist, but they do not support a war crime exchanged for another war crime. And I think the president has to be careful about that. And I would call him, because I know him well, I've had breakfast with him, I've had the honor of working with him, I would call him to bring us to a higher place, to let the American people, to really call to the American people on a moral issue of this nature. And then I think we can go forward and talk about the incredible things that he has done. But I am certainly concerned about his approach to this. And listen, my colleague Dean Phillips, everyone's got the right to run, but I'm sorry, I have no idea what he is running on that is different from what President Biden is running on. He took the same bold stances that President Biden has taken in this country on domestic issues, and I really don't see what he's doing. That's not the point for me. The point is, I want President Biden to be the next president, and he needs to call us to a higher moral place.
All right.
You know what? Pramila Jayapal reminds me of like the student that, no, I ain't gonna say it. No, I say it. She reminds me, there's different types of students, like, right? So there's different types of students, right? Some people say you'll have like the class clown, and there's a student that always sleeps in class, like that kind of thing. There's like the teacher's pet, that kind of thing. Pramila Jayapal reminds me of the student that will tell her friend / classmate, oh, you most definitely should. You most definitely should like push back on Professor so-and-so. You're totally right. You deserved an A on this paper. She'll push it. And then the moment the student is not around, she'll go kiss the professor's ass and make herself look good and say, I told her it wasn't a good idea for her to approach you like that. That's the kind of student that Pramila Jayapal reminds me of. Every now and then she'll say a couple good things, but like I said, the moment she receives any type of pressure and pushback, she tries to walk her statements back, and she makes sure to come in and save herself. Now, here's the thing. How do the American people feel in reference to this war in Israel? Now, Glenn Greenwald posted this poll here. Yet another example where the majority view of Americans in every political group diverges wildly from the consensus bipartisan view of DC elites. A large majority of Americans favor a policy calling for a ceasefire, which DC elites not only reject, but declare to be taboo. And I want you to look at this poll. Should the U.S. call for a ceasefire? 66% agree. 80% of Democrats agree. 57% of independents agree. And 56% of Republicans agree. The majority across political parties agree we should call for a ceasefire. And the majority of people polled agree we should call for a ceasefire. The problem is the representatives that actually do not represent us, but they're supposed to, they don't actually listen to what we want. We have no say so in reference to how our tax dollars are spent. And I think that we should. I think that when the House decides to pass a budget, when they do the budget passing every year, I honestly think the American people should be able to vote. We should have a say so in whether or not our tax dollars are being used to international conflicts abroad. It's our money. How do we not have any say? Think about this, people. How is this even allowed? It's our money. It never made any sense to me. Oh, Lana said, LOL, you mean Two-Face? Yeah, that's exactly what she reminds me of. She's probably that student. I'll tell you. Now, this is important because other countries are starting to back away. And that includes Bolivia. Now, Bolivia, they have decided to end relations with Israel. And just give it a matter of time, guys, before other countries jump on board with this as well. Now, this is coming from Bolivia. Listen to this.
Estamos remitiendo esta comunicación oficial al Estado de Israel, en la cual, como se ha manifestado, hacemos conocer nuestra decisión como Estado plurinacional de Bolivia de romper relaciones diplomáticas con Israel. Asimismo, exigimos el cese de los ataques en la Franja de Gaza, que ya han provocado hasta ahora miles de víctimas fatales.
I'm sorry, I forgot this doesn't have captions. I'll just read it for you. It says, we are sending this official communication to the state of Israel, in which, as stated, we make known our decision as the plurinational state of Bolivia to break diplomatic relations with Israel. You see what's happening, folks? Now, I want to show you something that you may not remember. This was many years ago. But in all of this, I'm actually surprised that Joe Biden has not consulted his good friend, Barack Obama in reference to this particular issue. He's consulted him about other issues during his presidency. And the reason why I say that is, as much as I despise and loathe Barack Obama had a different view about this issue and the Palestinians' right to self-determination than Joe Biden had. And I just want to take you back, because this was many years ago. But I want to remind you what he said in reference to what should happen with Israel and the Palestinian people.
The President of the United States.
Oh, this should be fast forwarded. Here we go. He's waving. Sorry. Here we go.
Thank you. Shalom. But the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, their right to justice, must also be recognized. And put yourself in their shoes. Look at the world through their eyes. It is not fair that a Palestinian child cannot grow up in a state of their own. Living their entire lives with the presence of a foreign army that controls the movements, not just of those young people, but their parents, their grandparents, every single day. Just as Israelis built a state in their homeland, Palestinians have a right to be a free people in their own land. The only way for Israel to endure and thrive as a Jewish and democratic state is through the realization of an independent and viable Palestine. That is true.
What's funny is that this was years ago. But if you look at the discourse on social media, and if you say what Barack Obama said then, which he also said again, some of this again in that recent statement that he had, now all of a sudden, you're a bad person.
Israelis must recognize that continued settlement activity is counterproductive to the cause of peace, and that an independent Palestine must be viable with real borders that have to be drawn. I've made the position of the United States of America clear. Iran must not get a nuclear weapon. This is not a danger that can be contained. And as president, I've said all options are on the table for achieving our objectives. America will do what we must to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran.
And look at where we are today. Now, back then, Barack Obama believed that a two-state solution was the way to go. I want to remind you, I have my criticisms about two-state solution because, like I said, there are too many settlements now for that to work. I don't think it could work now. But the other thing that I wanted to add as well is the fact that you have to remember Netanyahu didn't want a two-state solution. Even when we go back to the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, there were solutions proposed. Israel rejected it. So we always have to remember this. We have to remember that there were other alternatives that were proposed. Now, this comes about a time now where even the UN is starting to have some difficulty here, because it was just announced that the director of the UN New York's office is resigning over this issue. So I want to bring this up here because this is not good news for Joe Biden. The director of the UN's New York office just resigned after 30 years at the organization over the UN's handling of the ongoing genocide of the Palestinians. The entirety of his resignation letter is a necessary read, but his first page blew me away. Again, the director of the UN New York office. Here's the letter. Dear High Commissioner, this will be my last official communication to you as director of the New York office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I write at a moment of great anguish for the world, including many of our colleagues. Once again, we are seeing a genocide unfolding before our eyes, and the organization that we serve appears powerless to stop it. As someone who has investigated human rights in Palestine since the 1980s, lived in Gaza as a UN human rights advisor in the 1990s, and carried out several human rights missions to the country before and since, this is deeply personal to me. I also worked in these halls through the genocides against the Tutsis, Bosnian Muslims, and the Yazidi, and the Rohingya. In each case, when the dust settled on the horrors that had been perpetuated against defenseless civilian populations, it became painfully clear that we had failed in our duty to meet the imperatives of prevention of mass atrocities, of protection of the vulnerable, and of accountability for perpetrators. And so it has been with successive waves of murder and persecution against the Palestinians throughout the entire life of the UN. High Commissioner, we are failing again. As a human rights lawyer with more than 3 decades of experience in the field, I know well that the concept of genocide has often been subject to political abuse. But the current wholesale slaughter of the Palestinian people, rooted in an ethno-nationalist settler colonial ideology, in continuation of decades of their systematic persecution and purging based entirely upon their status as Arabs, and coupled with explicit statements of intent by leaders in the Israeli government and military, leaves no room for doubt or debate. In Gaza, civilian homes, schools, churches, mosques, and medical institutions are wantonly attacked as thousands of civilians are massacred. In the West Bank, including occupied Jerusalem, homes are seized and reassigned based entirely on race. And violent settler, I think it's supposed to be pogroms. Violent settler pogroms are accompanied by Israeli military units. Across the land, apartheid rules. This is a textbook case of genocide. The European ethno-nationalist settler colonial project in Palestine has entered its final phase towards the expedited destruction of the last remnants of indigenous Palestinian life in Palestine. What's more, the governments of the United States, the UK, and much of Europe are woefully complicit in the horrific assault. Not only are these governments refusing to meet their treaty obligations to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions, but they are in fact actively arming the assault, providing economic and intelligence support, and giving political and diplomatic cover for Israel's atrocities. That was the director of the UN New York's office, Volker Turk, High Commissioner for Human Rights. He resigned. Why did he resign? This is why I feel the UN is powerless. Because as many times as the UN has called out human rights abuses, they've called out war crimes, they've called out humanitarian crisis, as many times as people that have gone to speak to the UN, nothing seems to come from it. Who does the UN answer to? And we need to start asking these questions. What is the role of the UN other than to declare a crisis? What are the next steps? What happens after you declare that crisis and the countries that you are speaking to don't comply. What do you do? The fact that this guy is stepping down, he was the director, that lets you know that the UN is not powerful. They are powerless. The UN kind of reminds me, for those of you who went to undergrad, they have these, some universities have like a legal department, right? Like, well, they have like student court, like for students. Some universities have this. But then there's like the ombudsman, and the ombudsman, like they're just supposed to be a mediation type department. And it's like, if you have any type of a conflict or an issue, whether it's with a student or a faculty member, you can go talk to the ombudsman and they will negotiate some type of meeting and all that jazz. But nothing comes from it. And the ombudsman, half the time, you got to remember, they working for the university, so they're not trying to help you. At the end of the day, the bottom line is they are going to protect the institution that they work for. So what we need to start asking is, who the hell does the UN work for? Who do they work for? Do they work for the US government? Who do they answer to? What's the point? What's the point if you have no next steps? Anyone can sit down and visit these countries and write a report based on what they saw. And they can call out these issues. But if there is no process for accountability, what good are you? We need to start asking that question. I'm going to go to some of the comments here in the chat. Thank you for the super chat, AIM assistant. Genociding with Biden 2024. Thank you for the super chat, Zach. Sabby, have you ever discussed Bolivia before? They had a right-wing tyrant there, Janine Inez, back in 2019 to 2020, before being overthrown, and the socialists won power again, and now she is in prison. Interesting. Tony says KJP said the same thing too. Yeah. See how people change their... Thank you for the super chat, Timbo. Sabby, it ain't Joe Biden, it's the neocons and the, I'm not going to say that on here, who own 33% of the U.S. wealth. That's who runs the government plus the military industrial complex. Thank you, Jay. I hate to be a downer, but Obama's speech has no merit because he sold Israel billions in military aid, who then used that weaponry against Palestine. It's very hypocritical. There you go. And thank you, 007. My dog's poop would be a better president than Biden. LOL. That is interesting. That is interesting. Now, this leads into the story about the squad. Because when you speak up about certain issues, certain PACs and super PACs will come for you. Before we get into that story, if you have not had a chance to do so, don't forget to hit the like button. That helps me out with the algo. Thank you. It appears, according to the Washington Post, the squad is being challenged. And it's all because of the statements that they've made in support of the Palestinian people. Squad members face Democratic primary challenges over Israel stances. You see what's happening now? See what's happening? This is why John Fetterman has not spoken up in support of the Palestinian people. This is why Hakeem Jeffrey kisses Benjamin Netanyahu's ass. And this is why Richie Torres does the same thing. Let's go on. So you'll see there's a picture there of Cori Bush. St. Louis County Prosecutor Wesley Bell announced this week he was dropping his month-long bid to unseat one of the country's most outspoken Republican senators, Josh Hawley, to launch a primary campaign to oust fellow Democrat Representative Cori Bush. Here we go. When asked to explain his switch, Bell pointed to Bush's criticism of Israel. You see what's happening now, guys? This is going to happen, all of them. Everybody who speaks out in support of the Palestinian people or criticizes what the state of Israel was doing, they all going to come for your seat. And I already got an ad to show you that's already being used against Rashida Tlaib. We'll get to that in a second. Our world is in a dangerous place and we need steady and effective leadership, Bell told reporters Monday. And we're not getting it in the district. I think we have to stand with our allies, and Israel has always been an ally. Since entering Congress in 2021, Bush has publicly spoken about what she described as the outright massacre in Palestine and argued that the Black and Palestinian struggles for liberation are interconnected. On October 7th, the night Hamas attacked Israel and Israel responded with airstrikes, Bush wrote on social media to condemn the killing of civilians and called for ending U.S. government support for Israel military occupation and apartheid. See, let me tell you something they really don't like. They really don't like it when you use that word apartheid, but that's exactly what it is. Before setting his sights on Bush, Bell had unseated an incumbent to become a county prosecutor in 2018. Now, 5 years later, he is joining a growing cadre of people looking to issue primary challenges to liberal Democrats, several of whom are members of the House Democrats' left flank known as the Squad, who criticize the Israeli government over its policies towards Palestinians. Representatives Ilhan Omar and Summer Lee also drew primary challengers who cite their criticism of Israel as an issue. George Latimer, the executive of Westchester County, said he is weighing a challenge to Representative Jamal Bowman, another member of the Squad, with Israel as a potentially defining issue in that race. It might be that this becomes a proxy argument between the left and the far left, Latimer told the Washington Post. Support for Israel by the U.S. is a source of growing tension within the Democratic Party. While party leaders and establishment figures have largely been united in support of the 75-year-old democratic nation, the liberal wing of the party has grown louder in challenging the Israeli government over its treatment of Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. I want to show something to you that they did here. Notice how they're talking about the Democratic Party. And notice they said the liberal wing of the party has grown louder in challenging the Israeli government. So they essentially called the Squad members liberals. Just something to note there. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, also known as AIPAC, which has helped fund challenges to incumbents, it considers insufficiently supportive of Israel, declined for now to comment on the brewing congressional races. There will be a time for political action, Marshall Whitman, a spokesman for the group, said in a statement on Tuesday. But right now, our priority is building and sustaining congressional support for Israel's fight to permanently dismantle Hamas, which perpetuated this barbaric terrorist attack on the Jewish state. Let me ask you guys a question, because I've noticed something that people have been saying. Some people are saying, well, if it wasn't for Hamas, this would have never happened to the Palestinian people. So let me ask you a question. 75 years ago, when occupation started, was there a Hamas then? 75 years ago, when they started kicking people out of their homes and seizing their homes, was there a Hamas then? No. When people use that talking point to you, make sure you point that out. Liberal Political Action Committee Justice Democrats said AIPAC is targeting Democrats who criticize Israel and who also challenge economic policies that hurt poor and middle class people. What they really are is a vehicle for Republican dollars to be spent in Democratic primaries to elect Republican adjacent Democrats. This is a spokesperson for the PAC. They said that in an interview on Tuesday. Whitman disputed the characterization from Justice Democrats, saying in a statement, our sole criteria for supporting candidates, both Democrats and Republicans, is their position on supporting the U.S.-Israel relationship. In fact, our PAC has supported almost half of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. It is entirely consistent with progressive values to stand with the Jewish state. Is it consistent with progressive values to stand in support of apartheid? Because you see, that's the question that I would ask. Is it? Netanyahu is right wing. Is it consistent with progressive values to stand with a right wing brutal leader? No, it is not. The people that do these interviews, they don't push back because they want to keep their job at the Washington Post. During Omar's first term, she wrote in 2019 social media posts that Israel's allies in American politics were motivated by money rather than principle, playing into historical stereotypes about wealthy Jews. House Democratic leaders publicly rebuked Omar's comments, to which Omar responded with a statement that said, I unequivocally apologize. Then in June 2021, Omar wrote on social media, we have seen unthinkable atrocities committed by the U.S., Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban. After Democrats and others criticized her remarks, Omar said she was in no way equating terrorist organizations with democratic countries with well-established judicial systems. Shortly after Republicans took the House majority in 2023, they voted to remove Omar from the Foreign Affairs Committee, with Kevin McCarthy, who was House Speaker at the time, saying Omar made repeated anti-Semitic and anti-American remarks. So what they're basically doing now is that if you criticize the state of Israel in any way, shape, or form, they're going to use the trope that you're anti-Semitic against you. And no country is above criticism. None. But this is what they're doing. Last week, Omar said the U.S. should fully oppose the expected Israeli ground invasion into Gaza, citing concerns about civilian deaths and broadening the conflict globally. Omar is now facing two challengers in the Democratic primary. So she has two challengers. One of those challengers, Air Force veteran Tim Peterson, criticized Omar's comments on Israel and said in an interview with The Post, this isn't the first time or the last time. Ilhan will parrot Iran's talking points. A spokeswoman for the other Democratic challenger in the race, attorney Sarah Gad, pointed to Gad's previous comments accusing Omar of using divisive rhetoric that serves no useful purpose other than to inflame the situation. You know what? When Justice Democrats started, you know what they didn't figure out how to deal with? The Israel issue. They never really, I don't know if these politicians were coached before they actually took these positions in the House, but it appears to me that it wasn't explained to them how to deal with this particular issue, which is a tough issue to deal with in DC, because the majority of people in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party agreed to support the state of Israel. And of course, they made that piece of legislation where they said unwavering support for Israel, which means that Netanyahu can do whatever he wants to do. And the US government is going to continue to support him. They didn't coach them on how to deal with this issue. Moving on, a spokesman for Omar referred to comments she posted on social media highlighting what she called downright genocidal rhetoric from Representative Brian Mast and insulting and Islamophobic advertising directed at her from AIPAC. Yeah, and that has happened. Like, let's go to Summer Lee. Lee, whose congressional district includes Pittsburgh, explained her opposition to the Standing with Israel resolution in the House, writing in a statement that the measure does not acknowledge the overwhelming loss of life and humanity of Palestinians, which move us further from, not closer to, a just, lasting peace. Patel said in a Monday interview that she would have voted for the resolution. Our current representative has been voting on the fringe. You have an obligation to be there for your community when they're suffering, to understand their plan and reflect that when you vote. Whew. Boy. In 2022, Lee was elected to Congress despite an ad blitz in the primary by a pro-Israel super PAC. She won the primary by fewer than 1,000 votes, beating a candidate who had, among other things, called for strengthening the relationship between the United States and Israel. So just remember, Summer Lee, her race was close. She's going to be one of the ones they're going to try to get out. They'll probably try to get her out next when she's up for re-election. Watch. Bowman, who was an educator who ran in the Democratic primary in 2020, a staunch defender of, who ran against Elliot Engel, a staunch defender of Israel. Bowman won despite millions of dollars in ads from pro-Israel groups that supported Engel. According to a June 2020 letter by Bowman, the future congressman said he opposed the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And this is where it caused uproar with Jamal Bowman and, I forgot the name of the group. DSA, sorry. It caused an uproar between Jamal Bowman and DSA because one of the principles that DSA has is that you support BDS and you oppose what the state of Israel is doing to the Palestinians. So that was a controversial thing for him, where they were actually deciding whether or not they wanted to vote him out of DSA. I remember that. In covering that, he said, I also believe that Palestinians are entitled to the same human rights, safety from violence, and self-determination in the state of their own. But here's the thing, you can't even say that. Even if you try to both sides it, which is what Jamal Bowman has tried to do, they'll still come after you. So here we go here. Bowman boycotted a joint session of Congress where a top Israeli official was scheduled to speak. From Israel to India, we must hold our allies accountable when it comes to human rights violations and the abuses of far-right governments, Bowman wrote on social media, which is why I will not be attending the Israeli President Isaac Herzog's address to Congress tomorrow. Last week, Bowman voted against the Standing with Israel resolution in the House. Yeah, so we knew that this was going to happen. That they will come for anybody who speaks against it. And it's not just that. So there's already an ad targeting Rashida Tlaib from the Democratic Majority for Israel. We're airing a new TV ad in the Detroit area. Democrats support Israel's right to defend itself, but Representative Rashida sides with those who want to destroy it. Watch this ad. Watch this.
She's one of only 7 Democrats in Congress to vote against missile protection for Israel. One of only 9 Democrats against condemning the brutal attack on Israel by Hamas. Her legislation would allow the terrorists to rearm themselves. And she refuses to answer even this horrific question.
You can't comment about Hamas terrorists chopping off baby heads?
Tell Rashida Tlaib she's on the wrong side of history and humanity.
Let me pause here for a second. You notice how they inserted this piece here about the beheaded babies, which was already debunked? But notice how they're still spreading that lie, that propaganda. At the end of this ad, they said, tell Rashida Tlaib she's on the wrong side of history. Based on the poll results I showed you earlier, technically she's on the right side of history because the majority of people polled agree with a ceasefire. And I show you this to reference this because there's more. Reid Hoffman is also trying to create PACs to remove squad members from Congress. Now, you got to know about Reid Hoffman. Reid Hoffman is the co-founder of LinkedIn, but Reid Hoffman, he's a billionaire. He has given money to numerous candidates, including one of them being Crystal Ball. When Crystal Ball ran for Congress, he had a PAC that supported her campaign. Now, you'll see it. This is what I was telling you. They all coming out. See the billionaires. Look, Reid Hoffman-backed PAC may fund primary campaign against progressives Rashida Tlaib and Cori Bush. You see this? So that's Reid Hoffman. So it says a political action committee funded largely by LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman may be on the brink of launching a primary campaign to oust Rashida Tlaib and Cori Bush, according to the billionaire's longtime political advisors, Dimitri Melhorn. Melhorn told CNBC that he recently approached the heads of mainstream Democrats PAC about the idea of backing a primary effort against two progressive lawmakers. Tlaib and Bush are part of the so-called squad that also includes progressive New York Democrat representatives AOC and Jamal Bowman. Now, why is this important? Because it all goes back to money and corruption and electoral politics. This is what happens as long as we have PACs and super PACs and corporate money in electoral politics. Now, Eric had created this a while back, and this is what we were saying, like we need a movement around this. Money, corruption, demand, solutions. MCDS, money, big money runs everything in Washington, D.C. The answer to all why questions in politics is the same. Why are Democrats are so weak? Why are Republicans so vicious? It's because they're paid to be that way. Corruption. Our so-called representatives do not represent us. They represent the billionaires, banks, and mega corporations. They must be called out relentlessly as they are corrupt. Demands. Having a clear list of demands is crucial, and fixing big money in politics and government needs to be at the top. And then we'll get to 11 demands for real democracy. And then finally, solutions. Flowing from demands are the solutions. A movement has to be about more than just pointing out all the problems we face. It needs to provide a vision of a better world and a path to reaching it. So when we look at the demands, 11 demands for real democracy. The number one thing is fix big money in politics and government. This is what I was telling Dr. West as well. Until you fix this, you are not going to change the political system that we have in this country, which is inherently corrupt, and it's corrupt because you have corporate money and the military industrial complex and Wall Street. They all bought into the political system. 2, and I can put this in the chat so you guys can look at this on your own time as well. Healthcare for all. Now, Eric goes further and says, implement a U.S. national healthcare system, which is actually better than Medicare for all. That's closer to what they have in the UK. 3, a minimum standard of living for everyone. Everyone. 4, end the wars. End the wars, all of them. Disband NATO. These things are important. 5, reject censorship. Look at where we are now with people being deplatformed. Got to reject the censorship. 6, racial and criminal justice reform. This includes providing reparations for ADOS This includes ends mass incarceration and address the root cause of crime, which is poverty. 7, respond to the climate emergency. Implement a non-corporate Green New Deal program. 8, immigration reform. Abolish ICE. Notice you don't really hear the squad members talk about this much anymore. Notice you don't hear them say abolish ICE much anymore. 9, an election system we can trust. This includes ranked choice voting or star voting systems. 10, revamp taxation and funding. Abolish all taxes except for highly progressive income tax, wealth tax, and taxes on large corporations. This also includes establish public banks. And last but not least, 11, democratize the enterprise. Provide federal funds and incentives for employee-owned and controlled businesses. Enforce antitrust laws. That's important. We just talked about the story with Ice Cube and the NBA investigation. The NBA is violating antitrust laws. We don't have that much in place to make sure these things don't happen or that these companies are held accountable after doing that. So these things are important. And this is why we're sharing this is because, and I'll put this in the chat as well, is because if we had a movement around these issues in particular, then we may be able to see some type of change in the political system. But the reality is, if we don't have public financing of elections, these PACs, like AIPAC, the PAC Reid Hoffman is trying to start, this isn't going to go away. This issue will always be present. So that's important. That's important. All right, Eric, I'll go to the second page when you're ready. Robert said, don't let fat guys with money buy elections. Oh, damn, Robert. Thank you for the super chat, Zach. Thoughts on guns, Sabby? I support the Second Amendment. That's my thought. That's my thought. Everybody has a right to protect themselves. Let me pull this up here. Okay. And on that note, we are now moving on to the RFK Cornel West story. So it's a joint story. It appears that for the number of times that people have been saying that these independent or third-party candidates would not actually do anything or accomplish much, it appears that is not the case. And I have some new polling numbers for you. I want to get started with this clip here from News Nation about RFK Jr. 1 in 7 vote. This is important for people to see. And then I have recent numbers that I received yesterday to show you just how much the independent candidates and third-party are actually shaking up this race. This is important for people to see. Listen to this.
All right, welcome back to the Hill. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. looking to throw a wrench potentially into the 2024 presidential election. He is expected to announce early next week that he'll be running as an independent. New polling suggests that this could spell trouble for both President Biden and former Trump. The new survey shows the two frontrunners at just over 30%, with RFK Jr. sitting at 14%.
So at this point in time, RFK Jr. was sitting at 14%. This is right before he declared he was running as an independent. Wait till you see where he's sitting now. And look at where Joe Biden was 31%, Donald Trump was 33% in a three-way presidential matchup.
Elizabeth Vargas, come on in, joining us now to discuss. Hey there, Elizabeth. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Yeah, we made it on a crazy week. What do you make of that? I mean, 14%, you know, the PAC for RFK Jr. was saying they were at 17, 19, and we were like, yeah, but that's the PAC. This is a legitimate Reuters poll having him at 14.
Yeah, he's definitely appealing to a core group of voters. The question is where does he pull those voters from? It's interesting. I talked to a Republican strategist who said that he was up in New Hampshire, and I was asking him which of the Republican candidates might have a chance of coming close, at least, to former President Trump. And he said, Actually, the most signs I saw in New Hampshire were for Bobby Kennedy. So it says something. He has an appeal. And a lot of people who are Trump supporters find Bobby Kennedy very appealing. We, in fact, know that a lot of Trump backers have been also backing Kennedy, perhaps as a spoiler. So maybe his decision to jump in as an independent will change things up. I don't know. It's interesting. I asked him, Blake, in the town hall that we had here on News Nation with him, that question of whether or not he would ever run as an independent. And he said, absolutely not. I'm a Democrat. I was born a Democrat. We're a family of Democrats. He was very passionate about it, and he's now changing his tune.
You know, you mentioned that there's the thinking that maybe he actually does draw more from Republicans, in this case, potentially Donald Trump, than Democrats. We know his stance on vaccines, right?
Yes.
There was an interesting poll about COVID.
And
about
lots of
whether you were likely
conspiracies,
to
by the way. There's lots of conspiracies.
Yeah.
And I'll stop there because then they get into the jab and stuff like that. But it says partisan views on the jab, and it says likely to have already received the updated jab. And it says 69% of Democrats did, 28% of Republicans did, and 51% of independents. Now, that was right before he announced that he was running as an independent. Let me show you where he's at right now, because this is going to blow your mind if you have not seen this yet. As of recent, this is the recent Quinnipiac poll. Right now, RFK Jr. is now sitting at 22% in a three-way matchup of him, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump, which means, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty in a second, which means that RFK Jr.'s poll numbers increased after he left the Democratic Party. Now, if we pay attention to these numbers, this proves something that I've been saying for a while, which is that Biden supporters are not flocking to RFK Jr. What I said is that the people who are going to support RFK Jr. are former Trump supporters, independents, and primarily libertarians. Most of us on the left, for the most part, the lefties, are not flocking to RFK Jr. Some of that has to do with his position in reference to Israel and Palestine. Some of it has to do with the fact that he just has not spoken to the left audiences. We haven't seen him on Useful Idiots. He hasn't been on Bad Faith. He ain't been on this show. I don't think they'll ever let him come on this show. But he hasn't been on Bad Faith. He hasn't been on, has he been on Secular Talk? No, I don't think he's been on Secular Talk, or I don't think so. No. So yeah, he hasn't been on the Gray Zone. Remember that conversation was supposed to happen with him and Max Blumenthal. Did not happen. So as I said a couple of months ago, he is getting the support from independents, libertarians, and former Trump supporters. And when he decided to run as an independent, that actually increased his poll numbers. Now, we're going to get into this clip here from One. It says the U.S. may see a three-way contest in 2024 presidential polls. If this happens, this is huge.
In the two-party political landscape of the United States, the stage is set for a hypothetical three-way contest in the year 2024. Apart from the main rivals, the incumbent President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump, this time a third contestant is gaining traction. A recent poll showing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. with 22% support. The latest Quinnipiac University survey, in fact, showing that Biden got 39% of the vote, Trump with 36%, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. with 22%.
So as I predicted, for the people who said RFK Jr. would hurt Joe Biden, it appears RFK Jr. hurts Donald Trump. Now, we can also argue again, too, that some of the people that are voting independent that always either vote independent or third party as well. regardless. So some of that is in there as well. We also have to remember that the Green Party right now does not have a presidential candidate. So we have to wait and see who is announced through that as well. And from what I understand, the Libertarian candidate, Lars, I forget dude's last name, doesn't seem to be performing as well from what I understand, but it's still kind of early. But this is exactly what I predicted would happen.
The overall 22%, by the way, does not suggest that Kennedy Jr. can yet break through the two-party system. But the bigger threat his nomination poses to Biden and Trump is the possibility of siphoning just enough votes from one of them to swing an otherwise coin flip competition. The poll surveyed 1,610 self-identified registered voters between the 26th and the 30th of October. And when the independents were removed, the poll found that in the race between Biden and Trump, 47% of the voters would support the Democratic incumbent over his Republican predecessors, 46%.
Now, this is how close it is. This is the poll when they remove RFK Jr. from the poll. Okay, so when it's just Donald Trump and just Joe Biden, 47% versus 46%. So obviously very close between Biden and Trump. And we'll go into some of the things I want to show you from this poll because they include Cornel West in one of these polls as well. This mouse is annoying. I think I need to put batteries in this mouse or something. I just hate how it does this. Sorry, guys. Anyway, I want to jump down to this part right here, which is general election. So we went over those numbers. Now, general election with independent candidates. When the hypothetical 2024 general election matchup broadens to include environmental lawyer, we're not going to say that part. It's ridiculous. RFK Jr., who is running as an independent candidate, Biden receives 39% support. Trump receives 36% support. And Kennedy receives 22% support. Among independents, 36% support Kennedy, 31% support Trump, and 30% support Joe Biden. So RFK Jr. is capturing, sorry, I just wanted to make this bigger. He is capturing a significant portion of the independents, the registered independents. When progressive activist Cornel West, who is running as an independent candidate, is added to make a four-person hypothetical 2024 general election matchup, voters give Biden 36%, Trump 35%, Kennedy 19%, and West 6%. So something happens here. When you add Cornel West into this equation, all of a sudden, RFK Jr.'s 22% is now down to 19%. So I appear what may be happening, it may be some people may like both of them or whatever. And Biden is at 36%, Trump is at 35%. So this is interesting. This is interesting. Among independents, 33% support Kennedy, 30% support Trump, 27% support Biden, and 8% support Cornel West. So you see, again, once they add in Cornel West in reference to independent voters, the numbers change. Let's go on here. With minority and younger voters seeming intrigued, Kennedy, for now, enjoys the kind of demographic support his charismatic father and uncles generated decades ago. Enthusiasm. I just wanted to show this. In measuring motivation to vote in next year's presidential election, 48% of voters say they are more motivated to vote than in past presidential elections. Everybody hear that? 9% say they're less motivated. 42% say they're just as motivated as usual. Why do you feel people are more motivated to vote this time around? I think it's because there's more options. Now, some of you are wondering, how could RFK Jr.'s support have increased? He's horrible on Israel and Palestine. Well, for one, not everyone has heard his position in reference to Israel and Palestine. Not everyone's on Twitter. Not everyone's seen these interviews that RFK Jr. has had. And also, he hasn't really, with the exception of the interview on Rising, when Bree did challenge him on that, he hasn't really sat down with someone who's been over there in Gaza and has actually seen what Palestinian people are going through. He hasn't sat down with Max Blumenthal. He hasn't sat down with Katie Halper. He hasn't sat down with Anya Parampil. Like, these are all people that have been over there. Like, so they know what they saw. So the thing is I think a lot of the talks and things that he's had as well, from the videos that I've seen, it seems like this particular issue, you got to remember, until October 7th, a lot of people weren't even paying attention to what's happening in Israel and Gaza. Since October 7th, things have changed. So some people may not even realize how he feels about this particular issue, especially if he's mainly focusing on what happened during the pandemic. And if he's focusing on censorship, you know, so there's that. Now, there's also a donor issue as well. I talked about the donor issue with Cornel West. Here's a donor issue with RFK Jr. RFK Jr.'s donor data reveals his 2024 threat. So again, I predicted this as well. RFK Jr. is collecting checks from past Donald Trump donors at a much higher rate than former Joe Biden contributors, a sign the independent presidential hopeful may pull more from the Republican electorate than Democratic voters. This is important. This is what I've been trying to tell people. A political analysis of campaign finance records also show that Kennedy's bid has drawn millions of dollars from donors who kept their wallets shut in the last two presidential elections, suggesting he is activating people who have been turned off by what major parties have been offering. And I want to let you guys know, RFK Jr. raised over raised over $11 million this month. So this is not a grassroots campaign. And I've explained this before. Like, he has people like David Sachs who are hosting fundraisers for him, which David Sachs is also host fundraiser for Vivek Ramaswamy and Ron DeSantis as well. So he all over the place. But the thing is, he's taking big money. And remember what Jill Stein told me when she was on this show. She said the way that someone like RFK Jr. may be able to get on the ballot in all these states is just by buying your way on the ballot. You can do that. If you have the money, you can just buy your way on it. And you don't have to worry about getting all these signatures, yada, yada, right? Now, it goes on to say, though both parties insist Kennedy will be a non-factor in the campaign, there's clear anxiety about his potential impact, especially among Republicans. The analysis of Kennedy's campaign donations as of the most recent filing deadline shows why. His large dollar donor base has a clear Republican lean. That also fits with the limited polling that suggests Kennedy might draw more support from Republican-leaning donors. And we're just seeing this as well. Most of the 10 million Kennedy raised from large dollar donors through September 30th came from voters who did not make a federal donation during either of the 2016 or the 2020 election cycles. See? And here's that chart. Most of RFK's money has come from donors who have not given to either party recently. What that means is that his campaign is activating people who were kind of just disillusioned with donating to campaigns in the past and now are inspired to do so. Now, let me go here. So it shows you he's raised over $5 million in small dollar donations, over $1.4 million in large dollar donations, with Democrat history. He's raised over $2 million, large dollar donations with Republican history. And then he's raised $6.6 million, large dollar donors with no recent donation history at all. So don't sleep on RFK Jr. And I think mainstream media could be making a tragic mistake by just assuming he's just going to go away and ignoring him. Now, one of the questions that's been raised before, who do you think he would pick as one of his, as a running mate, right? I've mentioned this before. I'm going to show it again here. I think his pick would be Tulsi Gabbard or someone like Tulsi Gabbard. They agree when it comes to funding for Ukraine. And they also agree in reference to Israel and Palestine. They both back Israel unequivocally. Here's a cringe statement here from Tulsi Gabbard to show you exactly what I'm talking about. This mouse is annoying. There we go.
I don't know if Kamala knows what she's up to, but the reality here is when you look at things like what Representative Cori Bush is saying, what the squad is saying, what so many of these other people are saying who are accusing Israel of committing a genocide, it is the height of hypocrisy because they're apologists and supporters of these Islamist Hamas terrorists who are calling for a genocide, the extermination of all Jews, not just in Israel, but around the world. And we're seeing this being carried out by these violent mobs and threats and other things that are happening against Jewish people literally around the world. And the worst part is they're doing this under the guise of, well, we care about innocent people and we don't want people to get hurt, when in fact, they are in essence supporting and apologizing for the barbaric actions of Hamas against innocent women, children, and civilians.
I called it.
So you see, notice he's using the same language, the barbaric language.
Creating the monster, like they're Dr. Frankenstein. And now the monster in their progressive wing is turning against them. But they're trying to pretend like this is kind of a shocking development. It's not a shocking development. No. This has always been there, but it's also deeply anti-American, is it not?
It is, and it is against the very foundational principles and values of who we are as a country. These Democrats, they have called people like me an Islamophobe for many years just for speaking the truth about radical Islam, about the
They had good reason for doing that.
The threat that this Islamism poses to the freedom and peace and security of the American people and people around the world.
Well, do you believe, as do some of these Republicans in the Senate, that we should be bringing in more Afghan refugees? We brought in, 90,000? We didn't vet any of them. I'm sure some of them are great people and helped us in Afghanistan. But do we have 80,000 interpreters or drivers? I mean, I don't think so.
There are many, unquestionably. Yeah. But just like we're so concerned about Biden's open borders and the fact that we've got millions of people coming in who are not vetted in any way, shape, or form, who have not been checked.
But they don't share our values, to Nigel Farage's point as to what you're seeing in England.
Right.
This is, they say, you can't call it a clash of civilizations. Why not? It is a clash of civilization. No women's rights, no belief in pluralism,
Oh, now all of a sudden you care about women's rights? Now all of a sudden you care about women's rights, right? This woman, Laura Ingraham, you guys got to understand, she's an actress. Like, this is not real. What you see here, this is not real.
The dignity of the individual, free expression, none of that.
No.
That's not on the table.
No, and that is the hypocrisy of seeing these, the LGBTQIA activists out there holding and waving the trans flag combined with the Palestinian flags. Like that's
a new level.
They don't know and understand what this Islamist ideology is, this radical Islam ideology where they actually want to kill people. They want to kill those people specifically.
They have to tie Ukraine to Israel because they know.
You guys see what's happening here? See, this is why so many Americans believe that people who practice like the Muslim faith, this is why so many Americans believe that those people are terrorists, because of the shit that Tulsi Gabbard is saying right here. Never read the Quran, like never, just this kind of rhetoric and this kind of language.
Ukraine
won't stand on its
no,
own.
it's not
That funding and again,
over.
they're trying to cheat the American people through their representatives by saying, okay, you support and you want to stand with Israel. Well, guess what? We're going to sneak in all of this other money that we're going to take out of your pocket and your bank account to go and support something that increasingly Americans are understanding.
It's not
this
working.
proxy war against Russia is pushing us closer to nuclear war, and it's not in our best national security interests to do that.
So I seem to remember earlier this year when I was on Rising, I told people that Tulsi Gabbard, if it were up to me, I would not have invited Tulsi Gabbard to speak at the Rage Against the War Machine rally because Tulsi Gabbard is not anti-war. And as time has gone by, we have seen that some of the other speakers also are not anti-war. They oppose the war in Ukraine, but they're totally fine with giving money to Israel to do atrocious things towards the Palestinian people. I was right about Tulsi Gabbard. And I have no problem doing my victory lap about this. I was right about Tulsi Gabbard, and I tried to explain to people just because she doesn't want American troops to be harmed, just because she's against what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, that doesn't mean she is anti-war. You change that country to a Muslim or Arabic country, and all of a sudden she's totally fine with you wiping them out. But some have made predictions that Tulsi Gabbard would be someone that he would pick as vice president. Honestly, they agree on the Israel front. They both have no sympathy for the Palestinian people. They agree on that front. Both of them are kissing the ass of Netanyahu. They're totally fine with that. And they both agree in reference to not giving funding to Ukraine. So I could see him picking her or someone like her. Now we go to Cornel West. Now, Cornel West, as we all know, Peter Dow did resign as campaign manager in Cornel West's campaign. Cornel West has actually announced a new leadership in reference to his campaign, which seems to be a coalition of people. He said, excited to introduce a first of its kind cooperative campaign management model led by a dynamic quartet. Anthony Carifa Rogers Wright, Sienna Dent, Edwin De Jesus, and Madeline Merritt. Just as Brother Coltrane's quartet reshaped jazz, this team symbolizes a new era of political engagement rooted in truth, justice, and love. Let us work together for transformative leadership that prioritizes people over profits, communities over corporations, and democracy over duopoly. So he does have new campaign management, but I got to say this. I think what needs to happen in reference to Cornel West, I think Cornel West needs to start hosting rallies. And I say this because RFK Jr. and Marianne Williamson have been hosting rallies this whole time. Cornel West has been on the ground in reference to some of the strikes that have happened, the Palestinian marches, etc. So he's been involved with those things. But I think that Cornel West needs to have a rally for his campaign. And that has not happened yet. It is now November. We are now moving into the holiday season. And I think all you guys know, once you move into the holiday season, this is where you start to lose people. So then you have to ramp up again, come back next year, January, after the holidays. You don't have as much time to get some of these things done because before you know it, next November will be here sooner than you think. So if my advice, I think that Cornel West should have already hosted rallies by now, campaign rallies. That's my take on that. Now he did speak recently at the Palestine march in LA. And I want you to hear what he had to say in reference to Palestine. And it's tricky because it's like Cornel West is really good on the issue of Israel and Palestine. He's really good on that issue. RFK Jr. is not good on that issue. Marianne Williamson, she kind of in the middle with that issue. Sometimes she says some good things about it. Sometimes I'm just kind of like, what? You know, that kind of thing. But I feel like he's really good on that particular issue. I really like the platform that he has, which I've talked about on this show before. But at the same time, the campaign has to have movement. You have to do rallies. You have to that's how you're going to get the word out more. And right now, when comparing it to the other candidates that he's running against, they've been doing that. So right now, it may not seem like they're behind, but right now, Cornel West's campaign is behind when you're comparing them to the other campaigns that are already in this race. So those rallies need to happen in some way, shape, or form. I can tell you, as someone who lives in New England, RFK Jr. has been hosting rallies nonstop. Whether it's been Massachusetts, whether it's been New Hampshire, he has been hosting rallies nonstop. That's why he's doing so well in New Hampshire, just FYI. But this was the speech that Dr. West gave in LA. Listen to this.
I wish you could see how beautiful you look from here. But let the word go forth here and now that we stand with our brothers and sisters and siblings dealing with unbelievable assault and attack, genocidal on the one hand, but 75 years of it, and we still stand tall, they still stand tall, because anytime, every day people straighten their backs up, they're going somewhere because folk can't ride our back unless it's bent, and we are standing in solidarity. I come from a great people, the black people, been terrorized and traumatized for 400 years, dishing out love warriors, freedom fighters, wounded healers, and joy spreaders every generation. And I simply say that in the name of all of those freedom fighters who came before, for me on the chocolate side, but always in solidarity with any oppressed people, no matter what color, no matter what gender, no matter what nation, because we're talking about spiritual grounds, political grounds, and most importantly, courage. We're here to be courageous, to lift our voices in solidarity with those. We have to remind these narrow-minded politicians of Biden and Congress and corporate media that for us, a precious Palestinian baby has exactly the same value as any precious baby in the world. We don't care who, black, white, and indigenous. It could be Ethiopian, it could be Iranian, it could be Guatemalan. We stand here for the human. And when you stand for the human, you got to tell the truth. And the truth is predicated on not hating anybody. It's predicated on hating any occupation, any subjugation, any oppression. Don't let any of these mainstream folk try to manipulate you and say, you hate Jewish brothers and sisters, you hate an Israeli occupation. You hate an Israeli genocidal attack on our precious siblings, Palestinian siblings in Gaza. That's where we stand, and we shall forever stand, and some of us will be faithful unto death, just like those in Gaza standing up and faithful unto death. That's what this struggle is about, and we look and think of the 3,300 precious Palestinian babies. Oh my God, we don't have a language for it. We don't have words for it. All we have is our example. All we have is our stance. All we have is each other. That's why we call for ceasefire immediately.
That's another thing. RFK Jr. is not calling for a ceasefire. I don't know what Marianne's called. I got to go back and check. I think Marianne did release a video quickly about it. But right now, he seems to be the only person I see calling for a ceasefire. I have to double check with Marianne's, though.
Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! We call for an end of the siege, end the blockade immediately! And end the vicious occupation immediately! And let us have the self-determination of Palestinian brothers and sisters. And as we learn how to live with Israeli brothers and sisters, there's got to be equal dignity, equal rights, equal access, equal across the board. Wow, how beautiful it is on this lovely day in Los Angeles to let the world know, no matter how grim it is, we are still fighting, we are still free.
All right, great speech there from Dr. West. But like I said, like Dr. West should be at rallies, like or holding his own rallies for his campaign. And I think his poll numbers would be higher than they are now. You know, like RFK Jr. has been in New Hampshire, been all over New England, like multiple times. Like Cornel West should be holding rallies in New Hampshire, in Georgia. Just strictly for his campaign, just for the campaign. Like, yes, I know he wants to create a movement and there's other things he wants to do in reference to activism. And I totally support all that. But the rallies for the campaign should have started already. And that has not happened. But what did you guys think? Let's take a look at this poll. If the presidential election were today, who would you vote for? 3% said Marianne Williamson. 12% said RFK Jr., 48% said Cornel West, but the shocking part is 37% of you said you are not voting. Very interesting. Very interesting. These numbers are very, very telling. All right, we are going to do call in tonight. I do just want to shout out, don't forget this Saturday, National March on Washington, Free Palestine. That is November 4th, this Saturday, 2 p.m. at Freedom Plaza. That is supposed to be a huge, huge march. Don't miss it if you're in the DC area and you can make it. I already know a lot of people are going, so definitely check that out. All right. I'm just going to take a quick break and I'll come back and we'll head on over to call in. Thanks, Eric.
All right. You got it. All right, this is the part of the show where we give Sabrina a little break before we jump into call-in. Actually, here, I can give you a head start on the call-in link, and you can do call-in in your browser. Here, I'll put it in the chat. Sabby will be making it the pin chat soon. You can do call-in on your browser or your smartphone, and we want to hear what you think, and you can talk about any of the topics tonight. Or you can talk about most anything you want. Let me see if I can bring up that call-in page just to see what it looks like. It's down here somewhere. I got to kick some windows around. Here we go. All right, call-in tonight. RFK and West Pole, squad challengers, and more. Yeah, so after Sabrina takes a little break, we'll jump into call-in, and we hope to see what you got to say there. Now, let's look at what we got gathered up here for some of these chats. Oracle at Delphi said, "I don't trust the polling," and I mean that is always a question with these polls. It is possible to fake the polling. I mean, it is perfectly possible. There is an idea of kind of professional polling. There are correct ways of doing it where you try to account for the biases. You know, you try to account for things like people having landlines and who doesn't have landlines. So it's possible for it to go either way. I think the poller in that case, Quinnipiac, has been doing it a long time, and I think they're all right. But I mean, you'd have to really dig into methodologies and raw numbers and whatnot to really check on that to know for sure. And Rome said, RFK Jr. is there to give voters the illusion of choice change from the duopoly. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that one. I really don't see RFK. I mean, you know, there are those issues that he sounds good on. You know, I can't trust anyone who has no respect for Palestinian lives. I guess simple as that. Z-Manny said West is the only one offering truly alternative platform addressing most of people's concerns. Unless you include De La Cruz, why exclude her here? In terms of the YouTube poll that Sabby did, I believe they only give you 4 options, so it gets tough to include everybody in our little bit of polling. And I think as far as the major polls, it is. There is a concept of how many people know about the candidate and how big the candidacy is, but I'd be fine with including everybody. And Terry said the Kennedys have connections and money, like as far as why this campaign has the RFK Jr. campaign has legs. They have funding, they have all this good stuff. And I'll just remind everybody, this is where we give Sabrina a little break before we jump into call-in. People joining us, wondering what we're doing. Silji Lee said, does his campaign have enough money for a rally? Talking about Cornel West. I mean, in general, it's. I think the biggest thing the West campaign needs to do is generate excitement to be getting into a message that will excite millions and millions of people. Personally, I think corruption should be a central thing to that. Me and my MCDS, money, corruption, demand solutions. I think a campaign on that could be very exciting. You could really get people out there. And to me, it's not even whether or not he has money. It's a matter of, is he exciting? Is the West campaign exciting millions of people and really getting it going? If they do that, the sky's the limit. Anything can happen. If they don't do that, then not much is going to happen. And Dwayne said, yeah, West is the only candidate who consistently makes sense. And, amen to that, Dwayne. And thank you very much for the super sticker, Selji Lee as well. And we had one on the Rockfins. Actually, I think we had a couple. Let me bring that up. Yeah, I gotta tweak a couple of windows here, and we'll see what. I think we got another one from Roger here on the Rockfins. Another couple. Hit that. Here we go. Thanks for this tipped comment on Rockfin, Roger. Sabby, if the squad didn't waste so much time running scared of Pelosi, listening to her in letting themselves be coerced into cutting the umbilical cord connection to YouTube media, they wouldn't be running scared of wondering, damn, I betrayed my base for Nancy, thinking if I did, she wouldn't primary. This is their chance to pull a Justin Amash and jump out of the Democratic Party and run. Scroll this down and run as an independent. I mean, to me, that that's how you know that these supposed progressive Democrats are fake, is that they're not leaving that, frankly, genocidal party, a genocide supporting party, in both parties. It's the uniparty. So yeah, if they're not leaving the party, but both parties and going independent, then they're not serious. And thanks for this tipped comment from Hempcar. What happened to the weekend's face? Also, the WHO literally crossed off human rights here and added their code word equity for the masses. Added the code word equity for the masses, the middle class, the poor, and the first and third world, and all for 1%. And thanks for that comment, Hempcar. And the one other thing I wanted to, thanks back at you, Silji, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. And I wanted to, let me even these up. I wanted to, just before I go, there were like these 2 really good tweets from Caitlin Johnstone. Come on up. Here we go. Where one, she said, from Caitlin Johnstone on Twitter, the last month has really brought out the best in the best people and the worst in the worst people.
Mm-hmm.
But that was really on point. I'll leave it there. That's a good place to leave it. But base is always from Caitlin. If you're not following Caitlin Johnstone, you're doing it wrong. We'll see you in Colin.
That's right. All right, guys, we are heading on over to call in. This is episode 133, RFK and West Pole, squad challengers, and more. Let's chat. That link is pinned to the top of the chat. So I'll see you guys over there. So you know how we do this. Have a good night. Keep up the fight.